Hi, this is Katie Johnson, and this is going to be a video about different types of ink. We're going to talk about two black ink pads, the Versamark pad, and which of these black ink pads you want to use when you're coloring with which of these tools. I'm going to move these out of the way. This will be the second thing we'll talk about in the video. The Versamark will be the third thing I'll talk about in the video. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the colored ink pads. You're going to notice that these two look different from each other. This is the older style pad. This is the newer style pad. Anyone purchasing ink pads now, they're going to look like this. If you find older pads or have older pads, they're going to look like that. You can tell them apart for several ways. First of all, the newer pads are skinnier. They're not quite as long. The older pads have bumps along the side. The older pads have 3 dots down here. The newer pads have 2 dots up there. Now, the difference between them, and the only reason I mention this is because when I was first acquiring the new ones and then I had a mix of both of them, sometimes you have to stop and remember they open differently. So let me just show you what that means. The older ones, you have to push where those 3 dots are, and I've released a hinge. It hinges down here at the bottom, so as you're reading the name, and the old ones, they hinge and you flip it towards you. And then you slide it back in its track and lock it into place. The newer ones, they hinge up here. They open like a compact, so you just have to flip it once and hinge it. So that's the only thing I was going to show you is the difference between them. Now, so I'm going to create one quick image here. There's my line image of the flower. So now you're going to watch me do this in reverse to close it. Where this space is, that's for my fingers to get in and pull it towards me. And if my fingers don't quite have enough strength to release that catch because it snaps into place, I can use my other finger up here to kind of push on the end at the same time that I'm pulling. Okay, so it hinges, like I said, on the end as I'm reading the label. It hinges down here on the side closest to me where those 3 dots are. To close the other one, again, that space is for me to get my finger into, and I can pull it. If my fingers aren't strong enough to pull it, I can always come back with my thumb and give it a little bit of a push. Give it a little bit of a push, and then it just folds back in its track and closes up. Both of these pads are designed for the ink pad to be facing down so that gravitationally the ink is right always at the ready of the surface so that you get a good crisp image. I just stamped this flower in a color, but what if I wanted to stamp it in black and then color it with a marker? You'll notice that Stampin' Up! Does carry 2 black ink pads. We also carry 2 different styles of marker, and as a chemistry teacher I can tell you that your choice of which marker to use with which ink pad is a matter of chemistry. This is your chemistry lesson. The round markers are water-based markers. You need to use an ink that will stay on, stays on. You need to use an ink that is not water soluble so that when you color it with this marker, your image won't bleed. The STAZ-On ink, however, can actually damage the tips of these markers. These are alcohol-based markers, and so you do not want to use STAZ-On ink with the Stampin' Blends. You need to use Memento ink for that. Let's see what these look like. All right, I'm going to stamp with my Memento first. Memento is water soluble. I have a water pad off to my right, and I'm just all right, now I'm going to stamp it in the STAZ-On. This pad I also just inked up before I did the video, so that's why that's a little bit juicier. When I want to clean this, it's not going to come off with water, so I have a STAZ-On cleaner here. It comes pretty clean. Just needs to have a right solvent in order to clean it, because it's all about solubility issues. All right, that talking also gave this very juicy image a minute to dry on here. You may or may not have noticed, but Stampin' the markers have two ends, and one of them is a brush end, one of them is a fine point end. They show you pictures, but they also have bands down here. Skinny band is the skinny tip, wide band is the wide tip. I'm just going to color two of these real quickly. And you'll notice that my marker is going right over the surface of the lines, and I don't get any bleeding at all when I do that, and my marker tip is clean. No black on it. All right, these are the Stampin' Blends, and for the alcohol markers, they actually come in two colors, a light and a dark. I'm going to start with my light image. Same thing, two tips. They show you with pictures of them, and then the width of the band shows you which one is the brush end. And once again, I can go right over the black lines of the image, and and no problem with the markers. The nice thing about this is I can come back and add some highlights to it in that darker version of the color. And the reason they're called blends is because with a water base, the water sinks right into the paper, and so that ink is in the paper. For the blends, the ink tends to stay on the surface a little bit, and so you have an opportunity to move that color around before it becomes permanently on the page. So you can get a little bit nicer gradation variation on the colors when you stamp with, or when you color with the blends, and you get a more uniform image when you color with water-based markers. All right, so let's go back and talk about this STAZ-ON ink pad one more time. This was my water-based marker in the image that I colored with it. This was one I did a little bit earlier in the video. I'm going to get rid of the marker for just a moment and get my colored ink from a different source. I'm going to go to an ink pad. I can pick up ink with a paintbrush from this ink pad. Now it's possible for me to bring this brush directly up to the surface of the pad and pick up some ink, but then I'm going to have a discolored, very dilute spot on the surface of the ink pad, which I would have to go back and re-ink. But you see the ink spots that are on the inside of the cover? Watch what happens here. There is some flexibility with this pad, and I can squeeze really, really hard. And now when I open it up, there's a lot more ink that's been transferred from the pad to the inside of the lid. At that point, I can use a paintbrush or an aqua painter. This device is just a paintbrush that actually has the paint on the inside. So I'm going to squeeze it a little bit, build up some pressure that brings the water out to the surface. Then I can pick up my ink and come back and again color over that image. When you're all done, the cool thing about the aqua painter, you can just swish it on a scrap sheet of paper, clean it, and then it's ready to go in any other color. So now let's talk about the Versamark ink pad. The Versamark ink pad is actually a clear stamp. So it has no color to it, really. The color that you see is just because of the residual ink that's left on my ink pad here. You can see I didn't clean it very well on this side, but I did clean it well on that side. So once again, there's no color to it, but the interesting thing about the chemistry of this pad is that whatever color paper you stamp on, it's going to leave that watermarked image on the paper. It says that it's a watermark stamp pad. So I can go back with the with a stamp, and I can just stamp a whole bunch of images and leave like a background image on a project, because it has actually discolored the paper a little bit where you stamped on it. The other thing is this is a pretty gooey ink, which means that you can use it to hold embossing powder to a project. So I'm going to come in with that Versamark ink pad, that gooey ink, and I'm going to make my image on a piece of paper. And I'm going to add some white embossing powder to it. And again, for those unfamiliar with heat embossing, this is just a plasticky sort of stuff that's now held into position on the paper, and then I can heat set it. I'm going to do that quickly off camera. You're going to hear the heat gun go on. Then I'm just going to apply heat to it. I stopped before the process had finished because I wanted to point out the plastic has melted on this side. It hasn't melted on that side. So I'm going to finish it real quick. So there you see it all done. And here's a larger project. This was a background stamp that I used on here, which is why it's so big. And you can do this in all sorts of colors. Embossing powders come in lots of colors. This is a gold. You can compare between the two of them. Really pretty effects with the Versamark. Before I turn the video off, I'm just giving you one final summary visual on this. The STAZ-On ink is not water soluble. This is the ink you do want to use when you're going to use a water-based marker or do any kind of watercoloring. The Memento Ink is the one you want to use when you're using alcohol markers. Versamark ink leaves a subtle background image in any color on whatever color paper you're stamping on, and it can also be used for heat embossing. Thank you. I hope you found this useful. If you did find it useful, please give it a thumbs up. Then I know people like it. Remember to subscribe. Then you'll get notifications when I post future videos like this. And please give it a share or tag a friend that you think would find this to be useful information. Thank you, and stop by my Facebook page to see more information.